My wife was bleeding against the wall, and my son looked straight at me and said, "Dad, it was just an accident." Those 7 words changed the way I saw my son forever. 30 seconds earlier, his wife, Vanessa, had shoved past Helen hard enough to send her shoulder into the hallway wall. Helen was 67 that day. It was her birthday. The cake was still untouched on our dining table, and our 11-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, had watched everything. I expected Michael to rush toward his mother. Instead, he stepped between us and defended his wife. That was when I pointed toward the front door. "Take Vanessa and leave my house now." Please, before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Richard Benson. Helen's birthday had begun quietly. I cooked dinner, Sophie helped with the cake, and Michael arrived with Vanessa shortly after 6. Vanessa started criticizing our home almost immediately. The furniture was outdated, the dining room needed remodeling, the neighborhood was declining. Helen smiled through it because she wanted one peaceful evening with her family. Michael handled his wife the way he always did. He looked at his phone, changed the subject, or pretended not to hear. For years, I had mistaken that behavior for patience. That evening, I finally understood what it really was. After dinner, Vanessa began complaining about how much time Sophie spent with us. Helen told her gently that Sophie was always welcome in our home. "You spoil her," Vanessa snapped. "She's our granddaughter," Helen replied. "That doesn't make her yours." The room went quiet. Sophie stared at her plate. I told Vanessa that was enough, but Helen simply picked up the cake and tried to move past her. Vanessa followed her into the hallway. "Don't walk away from me," Helen stopped. "Not in front of Sophie. You always do this. You act innocent and make me look like the problem." "Vanessa, please." Helen turned away. Vanessa moved after her, pushed past, and struck Helen with her shoulder. Helen lost her balance and slammed into the wall. A framed photograph crashed to the floor. Sophie screamed. I was beside Helen within seconds. Her face had gone pale and she was gripping her shoulder. Vanessa didn't kneel down. She didn't apologize. She said, "I barely touched her." I looked at Michael. "Your mother is hurt." He stared at Helen, then at his wife. "Dad, it was just an accident." I couldn't believe him. "You saw what happened," Vanessa immediately said. She stepped into me. Michael rubbed his forehead. "Can everybody stop? We don't need to turn this into a family war." Helen looked at her son without saying anything. That expression on her face was something I will never forget. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. I helped her stand and then faced Michael. "Take your wife and leave." "Dad, come on. Now." Vanessa grabbed her purse. Michael remained where he was. "You're throwing us out over one accident?" "No. I'm asking you to leave because your mother is injured, and you're more concerned about keeping Vanessa calm than making sure Helen is all right." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sophie stood near the dining room, crying quietly. I hated that she had witnessed any of it. Michael finally collected their things. At the doorway, he turned back as though he expected me to reconsider. I didn't. After they left, I drove Helen to be examined. Nothing was broken, but her shoulder was badly bruised. We returned home late that night. The birthday cake was still on the table. The broken photograph remained where it had fallen. Helen sat beside me in silence for several minutes before saying, "He didn't even ask if I was okay." I knew she meant Michael. Neither of us spoke for a while. I kept replaying the moment in my head, not Vanessa hitting Helen, but Michael standing there afterward. He hadn't seemed surprised by his wife's behavior. He had seemed practiced. As though minimizing what Vanessa did had become automatic. For years I had watched him avoid arguments and told myself he was simply trying to preserve his marriage. Now I saw the cost of that silence, sitting beside me with a bruised shoulder. That night, after Helen went to bed, I cleaned the broken glass from the hallway floor. I picked up the damaged family photograph and looked at Michael, smiling between us, years earlier. I still loved my son. That hadn't changed. But something else had. For the first time, I understood that protecting Michael from the consequences of his choices wasn't helping him. It was helping the problem continue. I turned off the downstairs lights, knowing only one thing for certain. What happened to Helen would not be dismissed as another accident. This time, there would be consequences. The next morning, Helen was still asleep when I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and took out a small brass key I hadn't touched in almost 6 years. It belonged to a metal box hidden behind old tax files in my study. Michael believed the house he lived in with Vanessa and Sophie was his. Vanessa certainly behaved as though it was. But 6 years earlier, when they couldn't qualify for a mortgage, I had been the one who purchased that property. Michael knew that part. What he seemed to have forgotten was what happened next. I unlocked the box and removed a thick folder labeled Michael, Property Agreement. 6 years earlier, Michael had called me embarrassed and desperate. He and Vanessa had found a house they loved, but their credit and debt made traditional financing impossible. Helen wanted to help immediately. I did too. But I had spent 40 years watching money destroy families when generosity wasn't accompanied by boundaries. So instead of giving Michael the house, I purchased it myself and had attorney Evelyn Carter prepare a lease-to-own agreement. Michael and Vanessa could live there, make monthly payments, and eventually earn ownership under clearly defined conditions. At the time, Michael had hugged me and said, "Dad, you're saving our family." I hadn't thought about those words in years. Now I sat alone at my desk reading the agreement again. The title remained in my name. Michael had occupancy rights and a path toward eventual ownership, but the transfer had never happened. I turned through the pages until I reached a section Evelyn had insisted on including. Section 8, Family Safety Provision. I read it once, then again more slowly. The agreement allowed termination if an occupant engaged in threatening, abusive, or dangerous conduct toward members of the Benson family, particularly when that behavior created a reasonable concern for physical safety. I leaned back in my chair. I remembered arguing with Evelyn about that clause when the agreement was drafted. "They're family," I'd told her. "Exactly," she'd replied. "That's why you need boundaries written down before anyone believes family means there are none." 6 years later, Helen was upstairs with a bruised shoulder. I picked up my phone and called Evelyn. She answered just after 8. "Richard? Everything okay?" "No." I told her what had happened at Helen's birthday. I didn't exaggerate. I described Vanessa following Helen into the hallway, the impact against the wall, the medical examination, and Michael dismissing it as an accident. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When I finished, I asked, "Do you remember Section 8? There was a pause. "Of course I do. Does it apply?" "Potentially. I need to review the agreement and documentation." "I have both." An hour later, I was sitting across from her desk with the contract and Helen's medical paperwork between us. Evelyn read everything carefully. "Title is still entirely in your name," she said. "Michael hasn't completed the requirements for transfer." "Correct." She turned to Section 8. "And this provision is enforceable." Hearing that didn't make me feel victorious. Michael was my only son. Sophie was my granddaughter. The house had been my attempt to give them stability, not leverage I could use whenever I was angry. "If I terminate this," I asked, "what happens?" "They receive formal notice and time to vacate, according to the agreement. We do it properly. No changing locks. No threats. No shortcuts." "How much time?" 30 days under these terms." I looked down at the page. 30 days sounded both generous and brutal. "And Sophie? That's the difficult part emotionally, not legally." She was right. Sophie hadn't caused any of this. Could Michael challenge it? Anyone can challenge something. But the ownership documents are clear, and Section 8 exists for exactly the kind of safety concern you're describing. Evelyn watched me carefully. "Richard, are you trying to punish Vanessa?" "No." "Michael?" "No." "Then what are you trying to accomplish?" I thought about Helen sitting beside me the night before, saying, "He didn't even ask if I was okay. I want my wife to know that what happened to her matters." Evelyn nodded. "Then make the decision about safety, not anger." I sat there for another minute before pushing the agreement back toward her. "Prepare the notice." "You're certain?" I wasn't certain about what this would do to my relationship with Michael. I wasn't certain what Vanessa would do when she learned the house she'd treated like her own could disappear in 30 days. But I was certain about one thing. If I ignored what happened because enforcing a boundary was uncomfortable, then I would be doing exactly what Michael had done for years. "Yes," I said. 30 days. Evelyn picked up her pen. I'll have it prepared. When I returned home, Helen was sitting at the kitchen table with an ice pack against her shoulder. I didn't tell her every legal detail yet. I simply sat beside her and took her hand. For 6 years, that house had represented the help I'd given my son. By the end of that morning, it represented something very different, a boundary Michael and Vanessa had never believed I would enforce. The termination notice reached Michael and Vanessa 2 days later. Michael called me before 9 that morning. He didn't ask about Helen's shoulder. He didn't ask whether she was sleeping better or whether the bruising had improved. His first words were, "Dad, what the hell did you do?" I looked across the kitchen at Helen and stepped into the hallway. "I enforced the agreement you signed. You're taking our house." "It isn't your house yet, Michael." Silence. Then Vanessa's voice came through the speaker behind him. "I told you this was about control." Michael lowered his voice. "Dad, we have 30 days. 30 days. Where are we supposed to go? You have jobs. You have savings. You have options. Sophie lives here." "I know." "Then how can you do this to her?" That question hurt, because Sophie was the one person in that house who had done nothing wrong. But using my granddaughter to erase what happened to Helen wasn't something I would accept. "Don't put Sophie between us." "I'm not. I'm telling you your decision affects her. So did what happened at your mother's birthday." Michael exhaled sharply. "Vanessa already said it was an accident. And your mother was still injured. You're destroying our family over one bad moment." "No, I'm refusing to pretend the moment didn't happen." Vanessa took the phone. "Richard, listen to me. You are angry, and you're making a financial decision based on emotion. The decision is based on the agreement. We have paid toward that house for 6 years, and the agreement explains exactly what those payments mean. Michael said the house would eventually be ours. Eventually isn't today." Her voice hardened. "So this is revenge?" "No." "Then withdraw the notice." "No." She hung up. By lunchtime, Michael had called 4 more times. His messages changed from anger to bargaining. He offered to keep Vanessa away from our home. He promised there would never be another confrontation. He even suggested we all sit down together and reset. But through every voicemail, one thing remained missing. Not once did he ask how Helen was doing. That evening, Helen listened to one of his messages with me. Michael spoke for almost 3 minutes about mortgage rates, rental prices, Sophie's school district, and how impossible it would be to find another house quickly. When the message ended, Helen placed my phone on the table. "He still hasn't asked." I didn't need to ask what she meant. The next afternoon, Michael finally called her directly. I was outside when Helen answered, so I gave her privacy. 20 minutes later, I found her sitting alone in the living room. "Did he apologize?" I asked. She shook her head. "He asked me to convince you to withdraw the notice." I sat beside her. "Anything else?" "He said Vanessa is under stress and that losing the house could make everything worse." Helen stared at her hands. "Then he told me I was the only person who could get through to you." I felt my anger rise, but Helen touched my arm. "Don't call him. He used you." "I know." Her voice was quiet. "That's what hurts." That evening, another message arrived, this time from Vanessa. She said if we forced them out, Sophie would remember that her grandparents had made her homeless. I read it twice before deleting it. Sophie had a father, a mother, and 2 working adults responsible for providing her a home. The property had been assistance, not an entitlement. The distinction seemed obvious to me now. Apparently it had stopped being obvious to them years earlier. On the 6th day after the notice, the calls suddenly stopped. No messages, no arguments, nothing. Helen noticed it too. "Maybe they're finally accepting it," she said. I wanted to believe that, but Vanessa had never accepted a boundary quietly before. The silence felt less like surrender and more like preparation. 2 days later, Helen left for her regular volunteer shift at the public library. Before walking out, she kissed my cheek and told me not to worry. I watched her car disappear down the street. Michael and Vanessa had spent nearly a week fighting to protect their house without once making Helen's safety the center of the conversation. Now, for the first time since the notice arrived, Vanessa had gone completely quiet. By that afternoon, I would understand why. Vanessa found Helen at the library Thursday afternoon. She didn't call first. She simply appeared near the circulation desk while Helen was finishing her volunteer shift. When Helen called me, she spoke so quietly that I knew something was wrong. "Richard, Vanessa is here." I grabbed my keys. "Stay where people can see you. I'm coming." 12 minutes later, I found them beside the front windows. Helen stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest, while Vanessa waited several feet away. "I came to apologize," Vanessa said when she saw me. Helen looked at her, then apologize. Vanessa sighed. "I'm sorry your birthday got out of control, and I'm sorry you got hurt." Helen waited a moment. "How did I get hurt?" Vanessa's expression changed. "We bumped into each other. You followed me into the hallway, because you walked away while I was talking, and then you pushed past me." Vanessa shook her head. "We collided, Helen. It was an accident." I understood immediately. She hadn't come to accept responsibility. She had come to rewrite what happened. Then the real reason for her visit appeared. "Michael says Richard won't withdraw the house notice unless you ask him." Helen frowned. "Michael said that?" "He said Richard listens to you. Richard makes his own decisions." Vanessa stepped closer. "You know what losing that house will do to Sophie." Helen instinctively moved backward. That single movement told me more than anything she could have said. My wife was afraid of her. I stepped between them. "Stay where you are." Vanessa stared at me. "I'm talking to Helen, and she's backing away from you, because you've convinced her I'm dangerous." Helen spoke before I could. "No, Vanessa, you did that." Vanessa's face hardened. "So that's it? One accident, and suddenly I'm some kind of monster?" "This isn't about one accident," Helen said. "It's about you hurting me, and still refusing to admit what you did." Vanessa picked up her handbag. "Fine, keep the house. But when Sophie blames both of you for destroying her family, remember this conversation." "Don't use Sophie to threaten us," I said. Vanessa moved toward the exit, then stopped beside me. Her voice dropped. "You're going to regret pushing me this far." I looked directly at her. "Is that a threat? Take it however you want." I heard it as a threat. The voice came from behind us. Vanessa froze. A woman in her late 50s stood near the end of the aisle, holding a library book. The moment Vanessa saw her, the anger disappeared from her face. "Patricia?" The woman walked toward us. "Hello, Vanessa." Vanessa looked genuinely alarmed. "What are you doing here?" Apparently arriving at the right time. Patricia turned toward me. "Are you Richard Benson?" "Yes." "Patricia Cole, Vanessa's sister." I glanced at Vanessa. In all the years Michael had been married to her, I'd barely heard Patricia's name. Vanessa immediately stepped forward. "She has nothing to do with this." Patricia looked at her. "I've had nothing to do with it for 20 years. That's part of the problem. Stay out of my family." "Your family?" Patricia glanced at Helen's bruised shoulder. "Is that what we're calling this now?" Vanessa's face went pale. "You don't know what happened." Patricia's answer came without hesitation. "Let me guess. Helen got hurt, you called it an accident, and somehow everyone else caused the situation." Helen looked at me. Patricia had described the pattern without being told anything. Vanessa grabbed her bag tighter. "Don't listen to her. She hates me." "No," Patricia said quietly. "I got tired of protecting you." For the first time since I'd arrived, Vanessa seemed to have nothing to say. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back at Patricia. "If you contact them again, you'll regret it." Then she walked out. I watched until she disappeared across the parking lot. Patricia remained with us. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." I studied her. "How did you know what happened to Helen?" "I didn't." "Then how did you describe it?" Patricia was silent for several seconds. "Because I've seen Vanessa do versions of this before." Helen's expression changed. "Before?" Patricia nodded. "Your family isn't the beginning of this story." She reached into her purse and handed me a card with her phone number. "Call me tonight." "Why?" "Because there are things about my sister you need to know before you decide what happens next." I looked down at the card. "Does Michael know?" Patricia hesitated, and that hesitation disturbed me more than anything Vanessa had said. "Richard," she replied quietly. "The better question may be how much Michael already knows." Patricia arrived at our house that evening, carrying a brown folder. Before opening it, she looked at Helen. What happened on your birthday wasn't the first time Vanessa hurt someone and called it an accident. Then she placed the folder on our kitchen table. Inside were old police reports, court documents, photographs, and written statements stretching back almost 20 years. One report involved a former boyfriend. Another involved a roommate. A third came from a relationship I'd never heard about. The circumstances were different, but the pattern was disturbingly familiar. An argument escalated. Someone was frightened or injured. Vanessa minimized what happened, then apologized without accepting responsibility. Eventually, everyone moved on until it happened again. Helen stared at the pages. Why didn't anyone stop her? Patricia gave a tired smile. Because each time looked small enough to forgive. I thought about Helen's birthday. It was just an accident. Michael's words suddenly sounded less innocent. Does my son know about this? I asked. Patricia hesitated. Not all of it, but he knows enough. She removed several printed emails. The first was between her and Michael, years earlier after Vanessa had an explosive confrontation with another relative. Patricia warned him that Vanessa's behavior was getting worse. Michael replied that she was under stress and asked everyone not to escalate things. Another email followed a later incident. Again, Michael defended Vanessa and asked Patricia to let it go. Helen looked at me. He knew. He knew there was a problem, Patricia said. I don't know whether he ever allowed himself to admit how serious it was. I read the messages again. Michael had always described himself as the person trying to keep everyone calm. For years, I'd admired that quality. Now those emails showed me what his version of peace actually required. Whenever Vanessa became angry, everyone else was expected to become quieter. Patricia pulled out another set of pages. These may matter more to you. They concerned the house. 3 years earlier, after one of Michael and Vanessa's worst arguments, Michael had contacted me, asking whether we could accelerate the ownership transfer. I remembered the conversation. He'd said he wanted more stability for Sophie. But an email Patricia received that same week showed something else. Michael had written that if the house legally became theirs, at least one major source of uncertainty would disappear. Similar requests followed other periods of trouble. Each time his marriage became unstable, Michael seemed more determined to secure permanent ownership of the property. You think Vanessa was pressuring him? Helen asked. Maybe, Patricia said. Or maybe Michael believed giving her more security would keep her calm. That possibility hurt more than I expected. Michael hadn't simply been avoiding confrontation. He may have been trying to build a calmer world around Vanessa, so he would never have to confront the source of the chaos. He was trying to fix everything except the actual problem, I said. Patricia nodded. That's how it looked to me. I stood and walked toward the window. Until that moment, the termination notice had been about Vanessa crossing a line with Helen. Now, the situation looked different. The house itself may have become part of the system that allowed Michael to keep postponing difficult choices. Helen came beside me. He's still our son. I know. He may be afraid too, Patricia answered gently. He may be. But being afraid doesn't erase responsibility. That was the sentence I needed to hear. Michael could be trapped in a destructive marriage and still be accountable for what he allowed to happen around him. Those truths didn't cancel each other out. I returned to the table. Why give us all this now? Patricia closed the folder. Because Vanessa frightened Helen, and because silence helped this pattern survive for years, mine included. She left the documents with us and went home. Long after she was gone, Helen and I remained at the table. Will you confront Michael? She asked. I shook my head. Not yet. Why? I looked at the emails bearing my son's name. Because I want to see what he chooses when nobody protects him from the consequences. Until that night, I had believed Vanessa was the central problem, and Michael was simply too weak to challenge her. Now I saw something more painful. My son had known enough to recognize the pattern. Yet, whenever he faced a choice between confronting it and keeping temporary peace, he chose peace and allowed someone else to pay the price. Vanessa's anger had hurt our family. Michael's silence had given it somewhere to live. Michael's attorney contacted Evelyn 3 days later. The letter challenged the termination notice, arguing that 6 years of payments had given Michael a financial interest in the property and describing what happened to Helen as nothing more than a family disagreement. That phrase bothered me more than the legal, Threat. Helen had spent days sleeping carefully because her shoulder still hurt, yet my son was now allowing a lawyer to reduce what happened to a disagreement. I drove straight to Evelyn's office. She read the letter once and set it down. This doesn't change ownership. Title remains in your name. The transfer conditions were never completed, and Section 8 is part of the agreement Michael signed. Can he stop the termination? He can challenge it. That doesn't mean he'll win. She pointed to the final paragraph. What concerns me is the strategy. They're trying to minimize the safety issue. I knew exactly where Michael had learned that. For years, whenever Vanessa crossed a line, he changed the description until the problem sounded small enough to tolerate. An injury became an accident. Fear became misunderstanding. Now his attorney was calling it a disagreement. Continue with the notice, I said. Evelyn studied me. Even if Michael takes this further? Especially then. 2 evenings later, Michael appeared at my garage alone. He looked exhausted. Can we talk? I kept working at the bench. Talk. He remained near the door. I filed for divorce. My hand stopped. Of all the things I expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. When? Yesterday. He rubbed his face. Vanessa and I have been falling apart for years. Mom's birthday made it impossible to keep pretending. Part of me wanted to cross the room and embrace him. He was my son, and for the first time he seemed to be confronting the truth. What about Sophie? I asked. I'm trying to keep things stable for her. Good. She needs that. Michael nodded, then looked down. Dad, I know I failed Mom. I waited. I should have helped her. I should have stopped Vanessa instead of trying to calm everybody down. Those were words I'd wanted to hear since Helen's birthday. Then Michael continued. But if Vanessa is leaving, Section 8 shouldn't matter anymore. There it was. What are you asking? Withdraw the termination. Let Sophie and me stay in the house. I stared at him. You came here to tell me you're divorcing your wife so I'd give you the house? That's not fair. Then explain it differently. The danger is Vanessa, right? If she's gone, the problem is gone. No, Michael. His expression hardened. Why not? Because the house isn't a reward for leaving a destructive marriage. I've paid into it for 6 years. Under an agreement you signed. I thought it was going to become mine. If the conditions were met, he stepped closer. So you're really going to make your son and granddaughter move into some apartment because you're angry? This isn't anger. It feels like punishment. I set down the tool in my hand. Your mother was injured, and you called it an accident. Then you let your lawyer call it a family disagreement. Now you're standing here talking about the house again. Michael looked away. I'm trying to protect Sophie. Then protect Sophie. Find somewhere safe. Build stability that doesn't depend on property belonging to your father. You could make this easier. That's exactly what I've been doing for years. He looked back at me. I lowered my voice. Every time something became uncomfortable, somebody made it easier for you. Vanessa got angry, so everyone backed down. Money got tight, so I bought the house. Your marriage became unstable, so you asked me to transfer it sooner. And every time we made things easier, you postponed dealing with what was actually wrong. Michael went silent. Patricia talked to you, he said finally. Yes. His face changed. What did she tell you? Enough to know you weren't as surprised by Vanessa's behavior as you pretended to be. Michael sat on the edge of my workbench. For several seconds, he looked like the boy who used to come to me after making a mistake. I thought I could manage it, he whispered. I know. I thought if she felt secure, she'd calm down. Did she? He shook his head. I wanted to tell him everything would be fine. Instead, I gave him the truth. The termination stands. Michael closed his eyes. 30 days? 30 days. He stood and walked toward the garage door. Before leaving, he stopped. Do you still want me in your life? The question hurt. You're my son. Of course I do. Doesn't feel like it. Loving you and protecting you from every consequence are not the same thing. Michael said nothing. He left, and I watched his car disappear down the street. For the first time, my son had admitted his marriage was broken, but he still believed fixing his life meant preserving the house. Until he understood that the property was never the real thing he was losing, there was nothing more I could give him. 3 mornings after Michael told me he was filing for divorce, Helen noticed the dark SUV for the first time. It was parked across the street when she left for the grocery store. The windows were tinted, and she couldn't see anyone inside. 20 minutes later, when she came home, it was gone. I might have dismissed it if the same vehicle hadn't appeared again 2 days later near the library. Helen didn't tell me until that evening. "I don't know if I'm imagining things," she said. "You're not imagining being uncomfortable." I asked whether she had seen the driver. She shook her head. "No." And that's what bothers me. Over the next several days, I watched something change in my wife. Helen had always been independent. Now she checked the front window before leaving. She locked the door behind me, even when I was only walking to the mailbox. Once, I found her standing in the kitchen staring toward the driveway because she'd heard a car slow down outside. I didn't tell her she was overreacting. After what Patricia had shown us, I wasn't willing to make the same mistake everyone else had made with Vanessa for years. I called Evelyn and documented the vehicle, dates, and locations. "Don't confront anyone," she told me. "If Vanessa contacts Helen again, keep records. If there's an immediate threat, call the police." 2 days later, Vanessa removed any doubt that the situation was escalating. Helen and I were having coffee at a small cafe after a medical follow-up when Vanessa walked through the door. She saw us immediately and came straight to our table. "I need 5 minutes." "No," I said. She ignored me and looked at Helen. "Are you happy now?" Helen stiffened. "Vanessa, please leave. Michael filed for divorce. We're losing the house. Sophie doesn't know where she's going to live. And somehow you're sitting here drinking coffee like none of this has anything to do with you." I stood. "That's enough." Vanessa looked at me. "You got exactly what you wanted. I wanted my wife safe." "From what? Me?" She laughed bitterly. Helen fell into a wall, and suddenly I'm dangerous. Helen's hand tightened around her cup. "You followed me into the hallway, and you've been telling that story ever since. Because it happened." Vanessa leaned closer. "My marriage is ending because of you." I stepped between them. "Move away from the table." "Or what?" I took out my phone. "Or I call the police and let them decide whether this conversation should continue." That stopped her. People nearby had begun watching. Vanessa picked up her bag, but before leaving she looked past me toward Helen. "People who destroy other families eventually lose something too." Helen went completely still. "What does that mean?" I asked. Vanessa gave me a cold look. "Whatever you think it means." Then she walked out. I didn't follow her. I photographed her car as it left the parking lot and wrote down the time. When I returned to the table, Helen was trembling. "Richard," she whispered, "I'm scared of her." Those words settled the matter for me. The house no longer mattered. The termination notice no longer mattered. Even Michael's divorce wasn't the immediate issue. My wife had begun changing how she lived because she feared what Vanessa might do next. That afternoon, Evelyn met us at her office. We gave her everything: the birthday incident, medical documentation, Vanessa's appearance at the library, Patricia's records, the threatening statement there, and what she'd just said at the cafe. I also told her about the SUV. "Can you prove Vanessa was driving it?" Evelyn asked. "No." "Then we don't claim that she was. We document only what we know." I appreciated that. I didn't want exaggeration. The truth was enough. Evelyn explained our options and recommended seeking a restraining order based on the documented pattern of unwanted contact and threatening behavior. Helen hesitated. "She's still Sophie's mother." "That doesn't mean you have to accept being frightened," Evelyn said. Helen looked at me. I didn't make the decision for her. After several seconds, she nodded. "Do it." On the drive home, Helen seemed relieved and heartbroken at the same time. "I never wanted any of this," she said. "Neither did I. Michael will think we're attacking Vanessa. Maybe. And Sophie? Someday Sophie needs to learn that loving someone doesn't require accepting everything they do." That evening I checked the doors before bed. Helen noticed and gave me a sad smile. For years our family had responded to Vanessa's behavior by lowering voices, changing subjects, and hoping the next incident wouldn't happen. Michael had called that keeping peace. I had once believed him. Not anymore. Peace that depends on one person being afraid isn't peace. It's permission. The next morning, Evelyn began the process of asking the court for protection. Whatever happened with Michael, Vanessa, or the house after that would have to happen on the other side of a boundary we should have drawn years earlier. Michael returned the keys on the 29th day. He arrived alone just after 7 in the morning, carrying a cardboard box filled with garage remotes, spare keys, and documents connected to the property. I met him on the front porch. He placed everything beside me and said, "We're out." I nodded. "Where are you staying?" "A motel near Sophie's school for now. Vanessa is somewhere else. And Sophie? With me this week." I wanted to offer money. I wanted to tell him I could fix the situation. For most of his life, that had been my instinct whenever Michael struggled. This time, I stopped myself. "Make sure she feels safe," I said. His expression tightened. "I know how to take care of my daughter." "I hope you do." He looked toward his car. "Is that all? Unless there's something you want to say." There wasn't. Michael left without looking back. Over the next several weeks, I heard very little from him. Through brief messages, I learned the divorce was moving forward, and he had found a small temporary apartment. Sophie remained in the same school, which mattered to Helen more than anything else. Vanessa obeyed the restrictions on contacting us. The house stood empty. I visited once to inspect it and found the rooms strangely lifeless, without Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator or her shoes beside the door. I didn't feel victorious. I had helped buy that house because I wanted my son's family to have stability. Standing inside it empty felt like looking at evidence of how badly that hope had failed. Nearly 6 weeks after Michael moved out, my phone rang late one evening. His name appeared on the screen. "Dad?" His voice sounded different. Tired, but not angry. "How's Sophie?" I asked. "Better. She likes the apartment more than I expected." We spoke briefly about school. Then silence settled between us. I waited for him to mention the house. He didn't. Finally, he said, "I've been seeing a counselor." I leaned back in my chair. "Good. She asked me something last week that I couldn't answer." "What?" She asked why I was more afraid of Vanessa being angry than I was of everyone else getting hurt. I said nothing, Michael continued. I kept telling myself I was protecting Sophie by preventing fights. But Sophie saw the fights anyway. She just also learned that everybody had to adjust themselves around her mother's anger. His voice cracked slightly. "I taught my daughter that. You can teach her something different now." "I hope so." Another silence. Then he said, "I've been thinking about Mom's birthday." My hand tightened around the phone. I saw Vanessa hit her. It was the first time he'd said it plainly. No accident, no misunderstanding. I saw Mom against the wall, and I knew what happened. But before I even checked on her, I started thinking about what Vanessa would do if I blamed her. I closed my eyes. Why? Because that's what I'd trained myself to do. Keep Vanessa calm first. Deal with everyone else's feelings later. Your mother needed you. I know. His voice dropped. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. Then don't waste time punishing yourself. Change what you do next. Michael breathed slowly. I spent years believing staying quiet made me the reasonable one. He paused. Now I realize it only made me part of the problem. Those were the words I had been waiting for. Not an apology about losing the house, not an argument about payments, but recognition of what his silence had cost. "Have you told your mother?" I asked. "Not yet. You should. Will she talk to me? That's her decision. Fair." Before hanging up, Michael surprised me again. "Dad, I'm sorry I fought you over the house. You were scared." "No, I was entitled." The word came from him, not me. "You helped us when we couldn't qualify for a mortgage. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing that as help. I started seeing it as something you owed me." I looked toward Helen, who was reading across the room. "What changed?" "Losing it." He gave a quiet laugh without humor. "Turns out an apartment can still be a home. Sophie doesn't care about square footage. She cares that nobody is yelling." After the call, I told Helen what Michael had said. She cried quietly, but there was relief in those tears. She wasn't ready to pretend everything was repaired, and neither was I. But for the first time since her birthday, Michael wasn't asking us to change our boundaries so he could avoid changing himself. The house was gone from his life. His marriage was ending. His finances were harder. Yet something more important had finally begun. My son was learning to stand inside the consequences of his own choices without asking someone else to remove them. And once he stopped fighting to get the house back, I finally knew what I wanted to do with it. 3 weeks after Michael returned the keys, I called Evelyn and told her I wanted to sell the house. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You could keep it as a rental." "I don't want it." That answer surprised even me. 6 years earlier, I had purchased the property because I wanted to give Michael, Vanessa, and Sophie stability. Now every room carried memories of arguments, fear, and a promise that had slowly turned into entitlement. Keeping it would only keep me attached to something our family needed to leave behind. Evelyn handled the paperwork, and within 2 weeks the house was listed. Michael learned about the sale from me, not from anyone else. I expected him to react badly. Instead, he was quiet. "It's your property," he said. "You don't need my permission." 6 weeks earlier, those words would have been impossible for him. "I wanted you to hear it from me." "Thanks." Then he added, "I hope whoever buys it has a happier life there." So did I. The house sold faster than expected. After closing costs and the remaining expenses were settled, Evelyn called me into her office. "What do you want to do with the proceeds?" I already knew. Years earlier, Helen had volunteered at the Claire Benson Safe Harbor Women's Shelter, helping women and children who had left homes where fear had become part of everyday life. After Vanessa hurt Helen, I had watched my wife begin checking windows before leaving the house and listening for cars outside. It had changed the way I understood the word safe. A home wasn't safe because you owned it. It was safe because nobody inside had to calculate another person's anger before speaking. "Donate it," I said. Evelyn looked up. "How much?" "All of it." She stared at me. "Richard, that's a significant amount of money." "I know." "You don't want to keep part of it for Sophie?" I had considered that. But Sophie didn't need another piece of property tying her future to the conflict that had damaged her family. "Helen and I can help Sophie in other ways. This money should do something useful now." Evelyn leaned back. "Does Michael know?" "Not yet." That evening I told Helen. She was silent for a long moment. "All of it?" "Every dollar." Her eyes filled with tears. Margaret Benson would have liked that. I smiled. Claire Benson Safe Harbor had been named after my late sister, whose own difficult marriage had ended decades earlier. That history was why Helen had volunteered there in the first place. The decision suddenly felt less like giving money away and more like returning something to where it belonged. We arranged the donation quietly. No newspaper announcement. No photograph with an oversized check. I didn't want Vanessa to hear about it as some final insult, and I didn't want Michael to think I was proving a point. But he eventually learned. He called me the following evening. "Dad, did you really donate the money from the house?" "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." There was a long pause. "Why?" "Because that house was supposed to give a family safety. Somewhere along the way, it became the opposite. I wanted whatever value remained in it to serve the purpose it was originally meant to serve." Michael didn't respond immediately. "You could have kept it." "I could have. Or given it to Sophie. Sophie will be taken care of because people love her, not because she's waiting to inherit a building." Another pause. Then Michael said something I hadn't expected. "I thought you took the house because you wanted to punish me." "I know. But you didn't even keep the money. It was never about the money." His voice became quieter. "I'm starting to understand that. Months earlier, I might have explained further. This time, I let the silence do its work." A few weeks later, Helen and I visited Safe Harbor. The director showed us plans for additional temporary rooms, counseling services, and emergency support for parents arriving with children, and almost nothing else. In one room, I saw a little girl coloring at a table while her mother spoke quietly with a counselor. I thought about Sophie. I thought about how carefully she had watched Vanessa's face during Helen's birthday, already learning at 11 years old to measure the emotional temperature of a room. That was when I knew selling the house had been the right decision. I hadn't taken a home away from my son. I had stopped allowing property to substitute for accountability. And now the value of that same property would help other families find something Michael had spent years confusing with silence: real safety. 18 months later, Helen stopped checking the window before she left the house. It was such a small thing that I almost missed it. One Saturday morning, she picked up her purse, kissed me goodbye, and walked to her car without looking across the street first. For months after Vanessa's threats, that simple act had been impossible. Now the fear was finally losing its grip. Michael's divorce had been finalized nearly a year earlier. He lived in a modest townhouse, 15 minutes from Sophie's school, smaller than the house he'd fought so hard to keep, but quieter. Sophie had changed too. She no longer became silent whenever an adult raised a voice. She laughed more. She spent weekends with us again, and sometimes Michael joined us for dinner. Healing didn't happen through one dramatic apology. It happened slowly, through ordinary evenings when nobody had to calculate what they were allowed to say. Michael never asked me for another house. He stopped talking about what he'd lost and began building something of his own. His relationship with Helen took longer. The first time he apologized to her, she listened and told him she loved him, but she wasn't ready to pretend the birthday had never happened. Michael accepted that. Months earlier, he would have tried to negotiate forgiveness. This time, he simply kept showing up. One afternoon, I found an envelope in our mailbox with Michael's handwriting on it. Inside was a letter addressed to both of us. He wrote about the apartment, therapy, Sophie, and the years he'd spent confusing avoidance with patience. Then I reached the sentence that made me stop reading. Dad, you didn't choose a house over me. You chose Mom's safety over my excuses. I read it again. Helen sat beside me and continued where I'd stopped. Michael admitted that for years he'd believed being a good husband meant preventing Vanessa from becoming angry. When she criticized someone, he changed the subject. When she crossed a boundary, he minimized it. When people confronted her, he asked them to forgive. He called it keeping his family together. In reality, he had taught everyone around him that Vanessa's anger mattered more than their discomfort. I thought silence made me the reasonable one, he wrote. It only made other people carry what I was afraid to face. Helen wiped her eyes. Near the end, Michael wrote about Sophie. She had recently asked why they lived in a smaller home now. Instead of blaming Vanessa, me, or the divorce, Michael told her that sometimes adults make choices that have consequences, and starting over can be healthier than pretending nothing is wrong. That's when I understood what you were trying to teach me, he wrote. A home isn't something someone gives you so you never have to grow up. It's something you make safe for the people inside it. I folded the letter and sat quietly. 18 months earlier, I'd been terrified that enforcing the agreement would cost me my son. Instead, refusing to rescue Michael from consequences had finally forced him to confront the life he'd been avoiding. That didn't make everything perfect. Vanessa remained Sophie's mother, and Michael still had to navigate that relationship carefully. Helen still carried memories of the night she hit the wall. And there were things between Michael and us that time alone couldn't erase. But boundaries had created something denial never could, a chance to rebuild honestly. A few weeks later, Michael and Sophie came for Sunday dinner. Afterward, Sophie helped Helen clear the table, while Michael and I sat on the porch. "Do you ever regret taking the house back?" he asked. I thought about it. "I regret that it became necessary." He nodded. "That's different." "Very." He looked toward the yard. "I hated you for a while." "I know." "You knew?" "You're my son." He smiled slightly. "I'm glad you didn't change your mind." That surprised me. Why? Because I would have learned nothing. We sat without speaking for a while. Inside, Sophie laughed at something Helen said. That sound meant more to me than the property ever had. I had spent much of my life believing love meant helping family whenever I had the power to help. Age taught me something harder. Sometimes helping means opening your hand. Sometimes it means closing it. Love without boundaries becomes permission. Forgiveness without accountability becomes surrender. I didn't take the house because I stopped loving my son. I took away the protection that allowed him to avoid becoming responsible for his own life. And in the end, I didn't lose Michael. I finally stopped standing between him and the man he needed to become.